A wealthy father invited his child's nanny to a prestigious school dinner, expecting her to stay silent. What she said changed everything. The evening light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Ashcroft estate, painting the room in hues of gold and crimson. Frederick Ashcroft, a man whose reputation could make even the most seasoned power players pause, stood at the edge of his meticulously arranged dining room. His posture was straight, his tailored charcoal suit impeccable, yet his fingers tapped a restless rhythm on the edge of the mahogany table. In his hand was a cream-colored invitation embossed with the gilded insignia of St. Clarendon's Academy, the prestigious school his 8-year-old son, James, attended. It wasn't the dinner itself that made Frederick uneasy. He'd attended countless galas like this, mingling with the elite, crafting alliances, but this one felt different. This time, he wasn't entirely in control. Across the room, Olivia Bennet knelt beside James, patiently guiding him through a math puzzle. Olivia, the Ashcrofts' live-in nanny, was a constant presence in the boy's life. A steady, unassuming figure who had seamlessly stepped into the role of caregiver after Frederick's wife passed away 3 years prior. Her voice was soft, her hazel eyes warm as she encouraged James to try again. She exuded a quiet strength, a sense of stability that Frederick grudgingly appreciated, even if he rarely acknowledged it. "Olivia," Frederick called, his voice breaking the calm. She looked up, a flicker of curiosity crossing her face. "Yes, Mr. Ashcroft? There's a school dinner next Saturday evening," he began, his tone clipped but deliberate. "It's the annual gala. I'll need you to accompany us." Olivia straightened, surprise flashing in her eyes. In the 2 years she had worked for the Ashcrofts, she had never been invited to one of Frederick's social functions. Her role was clear. She was there for James, not to mingle with the elite. "Of course," she replied cautiously, her fingers brushing against the edge of the puzzle piece in her hand. "Is there something specific you need from me?" Frederick's gaze lingered on her, assessing. "Just be there." For James. He hesitated, a rare moment of vulnerability flickering across his otherwise stoic features. "And observe. You don't need to say anything." Her brow furrowed, but she nodded. "Understood." The following days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Olivia's life, normally dictated by James's school schedule and playdates, was suddenly filled with questions she hadn't anticipated. What does one wear to a gala hosted by some of the wealthiest families in the state? How does one blend into a world built on power and privilege when they've spent their entire life in its shadow? She decided on a navy blue dress, simple, elegant, borrowed from a friend, and paired it with a string of pearls her grandmother had given her years ago. It wasn't extravagant, but it felt right. Meanwhile, James was outfitted in a custom-tailored suit, his excitement barely contained as the day of the event approached. "Do I get to eat the fancy food?" he asked, tugging at Olivia's sleeve as she adjusted his tie. "You'll have to ask your dad," she replied with a smile, smoothing his unruly hair. "But I'm sure there'll be plenty for you to enjoy." On the evening of the gala, the Ashcroft car rolled up to the grand entrance of St. Clarendon's main hall. Olivia had been to the school before, but seeing it transformed for the gala was another experience entirely. The grand staircase was adorned with cascading arrangements of white roses and gold ribbons, while the soft hum of a string quartet drifted through the air. Men in tuxedos and women in glittering gowns filled the space, their laughter mingling with the clink of champagne glasses. Frederick led the way, his presence commanding even among this crowd. James clutched Olivia's hand tightly, his wide eyes taking in the spectacle. Olivia, for her part, felt the weight of every gaze that lingered on her, a mix of curiosity, judgment, and dismissal. She wasn't oblivious to the whispers that followed them. "Is that the nanny?" someone murmured as they passed. "She seems ordinary," came another voice, dripping with condescension. Olivia kept her head high, her expression neutral, even as the words stung. She reminded herself why she was there, for James. Everything else was secondary. The dinner itself was a display of wealth and refinement. The long banquet tables were draped in pristine white linens, adorned with crystal candelabras and gold-plated name cards. Frederick took his seat at the head of their table, with James beside him and Olivia discreetly positioned at the end. She had hoped to fade into the background, but James had other plans. "Olivia, come sit here," he said, patting the empty chair next to him. Frederick's jaw tightened. "James, Olivia has her seat." "But I want her here," James insisted, his voice carrying over the hum of conversation. There was a moment of tension before Frederick relented with a curt nod. Olivia hesitated, but finally moved to sit beside the boy, aware of the many eyes now focused on their table. As the evening unfolded, Olivia found herself observing more than she had intended. The conversations around her were revealing, parents discussing their children's achievements with a subtle undercurrent of competition, debates about new school initiatives that often veered into personal agendas. "Legacy is everything," one father declared, his voice loud enough to carry. "It's what we leave behind that truly matters." Frederick nodded in agreement, though Olivia caught the faintest flicker of something in his expression. Was it doubt? Or perhaps regret? By the time dessert was served, the initial awe of the evening had worn off for Olivia. The opulence, the conversations, the carefully curated personas. It all felt like a performance. Yet, amid the glittering facade, she began to notice cracks. There were moments when the laughter didn't quite reach the eyes, when the carefully chosen words betrayed deeper insecurities. Frederick was no exception. He was charming and composed, delivering a speech that earned polite applause, but Olivia could see the tension in his shoulders as he returned to his seat. She hesitated before leaning slightly toward him. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the mask slipped. "I'm fine," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. She wanted to press further, to ask why he had insisted she come tonight, but the moment passed as quickly as it had arrived. Frederick turned his attention back to the table, his composure restored. As the evening drew to a close, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger. Frederick's decision to bring her here, the dynamics she had observed, the subtle tensions that had lingered in the air. It all pointed to a deeper story waiting to unfold. And as they left the gala, James holding her hand tightly, she couldn't help but wonder, what role was she meant to play in it? The ride back to the Ashcroft estate after the gala was quiet. Frederick sat with his gaze fixed on the window, his reflection mingling with the dark shapes of the city speeding past. James had fallen asleep, his tiny head resting against Olivia's arm, his small hand clutching hers as though she were his anchor in a sea of dreams. Olivia glanced at Frederick, unsure if she should break the silence or let it linger. In truth, she had as many questions about the night as she suspected he had about her. The school gala had been a stark introduction to a world that Olivia had only ever glimpsed from afar. The wealth, the subtle hierarchies, the polished facades. It was a world meticulously crafted to appear effortless, but the cracks were visible if you knew where to look. And Olivia had been looking. The next morning, the house stirred early. James, already dressed in his play clothes, raced down the hallway to find Olivia. His excitement about the previous night hadn't waned, and he couldn't wait to recount every detail as if she hadn't been right beside him. "Olivia, did you see the big fountain outside the school? It had lights in it. And the desserts. I had 3 of those little chocolate things. Dad said I could have 2, but I sneaked one more." James giggled, his eyes sparkling with mischief. Olivia smiled as she listened, her focus on folding laundry. 3 desserts? Sounds like someone had a fancy night. James nodded emphatically. "I wish we could go to things like that all the time. Did you like it?" The question gave her pause. Did she like it? The extravagance had been overwhelming, the conversations often alienating, yet the night had been revealing. "It was interesting," she replied carefully, "but I think I'd rather be here with you, solving puzzles." James laughed. "You're funny, Olivia." By mid-afternoon, Frederick summoned Olivia to his office. The room was a sanctuary of dark wood and leather, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that hinted at a man who valued knowledge as much as appearances. He was seated behind the massive oak desk, sorting through a stack of documents. "Olivia, come in," he said without looking up. She stepped inside, her nerves carefully concealed behind a composed expression. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Ashcroft?" He finally looked up, his sharp blue eyes scrutinizing her. "Last night, what did you think?" The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, unsure of how much honesty was appropriate. It was an impressive event. The school's community seems very invested in its students and their futures. Frederick's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Spare me the pleasantries, Olivia. You're observant. What did you really think?" She took a breath, choosing her words carefully. It was clear that appearances mean a great deal to the people there. There's a lot of pride and pressure. But behind all of that, I sensed— She paused, meeting his gaze. "I sensed that not everything is as perfect as it seems." Frederick leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You're not wrong," he admitted. "That world thrives on perfection, or the illusion of it. And it's my job to make sure James has a place in it." "James doesn't care about perfection," Olivia said before she could stop herself. "He cares about what makes him happy." Frederick's eyes narrowed, but there was no malice in his gaze, only curiosity. "And what do you think makes him happy?" "Time," she replied softly. "Time with the people who care about him. People who see him for who he is, not what he's expected to be." The room fell silent. Frederick's gaze drifted to the family portrait on his desk, a frozen moment from a time when his wife was still alive. Her absence lingered in the air like an unspoken truth, shaping the man he had become. As the week progressed, Olivia found herself reflecting more on the world she had been thrust into. The gala had been a microcosm of the life James was expected to inherit, a life defined by legacy and expectation. Yet, James was still a child, unburdened by the weight of those expectations, for now. One afternoon, Olivia took James to the park near the estate. It was one of his favorite places, a space where he could run freely and let his imagination soar. As he darted between the swings and the jungle gym, Olivia watched with a mixture of joy and concern. How long would he be able to hold on to this innocence? "Olivia," James called, pulling her from her thoughts. He was standing at the top of the slide, grinning triumphantly. "Watch me." She waved. "I'm watching. Show me your best slide." He launched himself down the slide with a whoop, landing in a heap of laughter at the bottom. Olivia couldn't help but laugh with him, the sound lightening the weight she carried. That evening, as Olivia prepared James for bed, he looked up at her with a question that caught her off guard. "Olivia, why don't you have a family?" She blinked, startled by the simplicity and weight of the question. "I do have a family," she said, tucking the blanket around him, "but they live far away. Right now, my job is to take care of you." James frowned. "Do you miss them?" She nodded. "Sometimes. But being here with you makes it easier." James seemed to ponder this before snuggling deeper into his blanket. "I'm glad you're here," he murmured sleepily. "You're like my family too." Her chest tightened at his words, but she managed a soft smile. "Good night, James." Later that night, Olivia sat in her small room, staring at the moonlit garden outside her window. The events of the week weighed heavily on her mind. The world of prestige that Frederick inhabited was as alluring as it was isolating. And while she felt like an outsider looking in, she couldn't deny the connection she had with James, or the growing sense that she was meant to play a larger role in his life. And then there was Frederick. Beneath his polished exterior, Olivia sensed a man grappling with his own doubts and regrets. His decision to bring her to the gala wasn't just about appearances. There was something more, something he hadn't yet revealed. As she turned off the light and climbed into bed, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that the world of prestige wasn't as impenetrable as it seemed. Cracks were forming, and she was beginning to see what lay beneath. The sun had barely crept above the horizon when James came bounding into Olivia's room, his face alight with excitement. "Olivia, guess what?" he exclaimed, his small hands gripping the edge of her blanket. Olivia rubbed the sleep from her eyes, stifling a laugh at his energy. "What is it, James?" she asked, sitting up and smoothing her hair. "Dad said we're going to have breakfast at the country club today. Can you come?" Her smile faltered slightly. Frederick rarely invited her to social outings, especially not ones as exclusive as the country club. I'm not sure, James. Did your dad say I should come?" James nodded enthusiastically. He said you have to come. He told me it's important. Olivia's heart sank a little at his choice of words. Important usually meant there was more to the situation than met the eye. Still, she couldn't disappoint James. All right, let me get ready, she said with a reassuring smile. The country club was a bastion of old money elegance, its sprawling grounds meticulously maintained and its interiors exuding an air of understated opulence. Olivia felt every eye on her as she followed Frederick and James into the grand dining hall. The whispers were quieter here than at the gala, but no less palpable. She could feel the weight of their scrutiny, their curiosity about the unfamiliar face among the regulars. Olivia, sit here, James said, pointing to the seat next to him at the table. Frederick gave a small nod of approval, though his expression remained unreadable. As they settled in, Olivia noticed that the other tables were filled with families whose wealth was evident not just in their clothing and jewelry, but in the way they carried themselves. She felt out of place, yet determined to hold her own for James's sake. The breakfast began uneventfully, with polite conversation and the clinking of silverware against fine china. James was animated, recounting his adventures at the park to anyone who would listen. Olivia's attention, however, was drawn to the interactions between the adults. The conversations were polite but laced with subtext, a careful dance of subtle power plays and quiet one-upmanship. "Frederick, it's good to see you again," said a man seated at the neighboring table. He was tall and imposing, with a booming voice that demanded attention. And who might this be? His gaze landed on Olivia. "This is Olivia," Frederick said smoothly, his tone giving away nothing. "She's James's nanny." The man's eyebrows lifted slightly, though he masked his surprise with a genial smile. "Ah, well, it's a pleasure to meet you, Olivia. You must have your hands full with this little one." "It's never dull," Olivia replied, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. She could feel Frederick's eyes on her, as though assessing her every word. As the meal continued, the conversation shifted to more weighty topics: the economy, school rankings, the upcoming charity auction. Olivia remained silent, content to observe. But then, one of the women at the table turned to her with a question that took her by surprise. "Olivia, what do you think about the new changes to the school curriculum?" All eyes were on her now, including Frederick's. For a moment, she considered deflecting the question, but something in her gut told her to speak up. "I think the changes are well-intentioned," she began, her voice calm but firm. "But I worry they might overlook the importance of fostering creativity and emotional intelligence in children. Academic rigor is important, of course, but so is allowing kids the freedom to explore and develop their unique strengths." There was a brief silence, followed by a murmur of agreement from one of the women. "She makes a good point," the woman said, nodding thoughtfully. Frederick's expression didn't change, but Olivia noticed a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps? Or was it respect? After breakfast, as James ran off to play with some of the other children, Frederick approached Olivia. "You handled yourself well today," he said, his tone neutral but not unkind. "Thank you, Mr. Ashcroft," she replied, meeting his gaze. "I wasn't sure if I overstepped." "Not at all," he said. "In fact, I think your perspective was refreshing." Olivia wasn't sure how to respond, so she simply nodded. But as they left the country club, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Frederick's guarded demeanor had softened, if only slightly, and she sensed that her role in James's life, and perhaps Frederick's, was beginning to evolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. Later that evening, as Olivia read James's bedtime story, he looked up at her with a question that seemed to come out of nowhere. "Olivia, why do people always stare at you?" She paused, caught off guard by his innocent observation. "What do you mean, James?" "Like today, at breakfast," he said. "The grown-ups were looking at you a lot." "Why?" Olivia considered her answer carefully. "Sometimes people stare because they're curious," she said. "Maybe they don't understand something, and they want to know more about it." James frowned. "That's silly. They should just ask like I do." She smiled, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "You're right. Asking is always better." As she closed the door to James's room that night, Olivia couldn't help but reflect on his words. The stares, the whispers, the subtle judgments. They were all part of the world she had been drawn into. But she also realized that James's innocent honesty was a reminder of what truly mattered. And for the first time, she began to feel that she could navigate this world on her own terms, not just for James's sake, but for her own. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Ashcroft estate, bathing the breakfast table in a warm golden glow. Frederick sat at the head of the table, a coffee cup untouched beside him as he scrolled through a report on his tablet. His face was a mask of concentration, his piercing blue eyes scanning line after line of financial data. Across the table, James swung his legs back and forth, his small feet not quite reaching the floor. He hummed a tuneless melody between bites of cereal, blissfully unaware of the tension that seemed to hover over the room. Olivia stood by the kitchen counter, her hands busy wiping down an already spotless surface. She wasn't one to linger idly, but today she found herself stealing glances at Frederick, whose mood seemed darker than usual. She had come to recognize his subtle shifts in demeanor over the years. A slightly furrowed brow, the occasional, almost imperceptible sigh. Something was weighing on him. "Olivia," he said abruptly, breaking the quiet. She turned toward him, her posture instantly attentive. "Yes, Mr. Ashcroft? Have you spoken with James's teachers recently?" His tone was measured, but there was an edge to it, as if he were already bracing for an answer he didn't want to hear. "Only briefly," she replied, carefully choosing her words. "They mentioned he's excelling in his studies, but could use some encouragement in group settings." "Why?" Frederick set his tablet down, his expression unreadable. "There's been talk. Some of the other parents think he's different, too reliant on you." Olivia felt her stomach knot. She kept her voice calm, measured. "James is a thoughtful, curious child. If he relies on me, it's because I'm here for him as a constant in his life. But that doesn't mean he's incapable of forming his own connections." Frederick leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Perception matters in our circles, Olivia. People notice everything." Her chest tightened at his words, but she didn't respond. There was nothing she could say that would alter the reality of Frederick's world. A world where appearances were paramount, where even the smallest deviations from the norm could spark whispers and judgments. The day unfolded in an uneasy rhythm. James spent the morning in the playroom, meticulously constructing a tower of blocks while Olivia watched from a nearby armchair. Normally, she would have joined in, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Frederick's words lingered in her mind. Perception matters. She had always been aware of her precarious position within the Ashcroft household, but today it felt as if the ground beneath her feet had grown even less stable. By the afternoon, Frederick had retreated to his study for a meeting with David Langston, a prominent parent on the school's board of trustees. Olivia had heard of David. His reputation for sharp business dealings and sharper social commentary preceded him. She had no intention of eavesdropping, but as she passed by the study carrying a basket of freshly laundered clothes, the muffled sound of their voices drew her attention. "Bringing the nanny to the gala was a bold choice," David said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "It's certainly got people talking. She's part of James's life," Frederick replied curtly. "I won't apologize for including her." "It's not about apologizing, Frederick. It's about optics. People wonder what it says about you, about your priorities. You're a leader in this community. Every move you make is scrutinized." Olivia's grip on the laundry basket tightened. She hurried past the door, her heart pounding. She had known her presence at the gala was unconventional, even controversial, but hearing it framed so bluntly made her feel exposed in a way she hadn't anticipated. Later that evening, dinner was a quiet affair. James chattered away about his tower of blocks, his cheerful voice filling the silences left by Frederick's preoccupied demeanor. Olivia tried to engage, asking James about his plans for the next day, but Frederick remained distant, his mind clearly elsewhere. After dinner, Olivia retreated to the kitchen to clean up, finding solace in the simple, repetitive tasks. The clatter of dishes and the hum of the dishwasher filled the space, drowning out her swirling thoughts. But then, the sound of footsteps behind her made her pause. "May I?" Frederick's voice was soft, almost hesitant. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, "Of course," she said, stepping aside so he could lean against the counter. For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze fixed on a distant point beyond the window. Then, finally, he spoke. "Do you think I'm too hard on James?" The question caught her off guard. She set down the plate she had been drying and turned to face him fully. "I think you want the best for him," she said carefully. "But sometimes, I wonder if you're more concerned about what others expect of him than what he needs." Frederick's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not easy, Olivia, balancing everything. Being the father he deserves while keeping up with the demands of this world. You don't have to do it alone," she said softly. "James doesn't need perfection, Frederick. He needs you." Her words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with truth. For a moment, Frederick looked as though he might say something more, but then he simply nodded and left the room, leaving Olivia alone with her thoughts. That night, as she sat by the window in her small room, Olivia replayed the events of the day in her mind. Frederick Ashcroft was a man who appeared to have everything under control, a polished exterior, a commanding presence. But beneath the surface, he was grappling with his own insecurities and struggles, trying to reconcile the weight of his responsibilities with the needs of his son. The cracks in his carefully constructed facade were becoming more apparent, and Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that she was witnessing the beginning of something much larger. Beneath the polished veneer of the Ashcroft family lay a complex web of expectations, vulnerabilities, and truths waiting to be uncovered. As she turned off the light and climbed into bed, Olivia made a silent promise to herself. Whatever lay ahead, she would be there for James, and perhaps even for Frederick, in whatever way she could. The morning began with a palpable tension in the Ashcroft household. Frederick sat at the kitchen counter, nursing his second cup of coffee. His tailored suit jacket hung over the back of his chair, his crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. Olivia noticed the slight slump in his posture, a rare departure from his usual composed demeanor. James, oblivious to the undercurrent in the air, was engrossed in a drawing at the table, his crayons scattered around him. Frederick glanced at Olivia as she entered the room. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. The directness of his tone left no room for ambiguity. "Of course," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "Not here," he said, glancing at James. "My study." After breakfast, the study was a sanctuary of dark wood and muted light, the scent of polished leather lingering in the air. Frederick stood by the window, staring out at the sprawling garden. Olivia took a seat in one of the high-backed chairs, her hands folded in her lap. "I've been thinking about the gala," he began, his gaze still fixed outside, "and about the reaction to your presence there." Olivia remained silent, unsure of where this conversation was headed. Frederick turned to face her, his expression a mixture of determination and uncertainty. "It wasn't a mistake to bring you. I stand by that. But it's clear that others don't see it that way." "What are you saying, Mr. Ashcroft?" she asked, her voice calm but probing. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I need to manage the optics, Olivia, the way people perceive my decisions, my priorities. But at the same time, I can't ignore the role you play in James's life." Olivia frowned slightly. "Are you asking me to step back?" "No," he said quickly, shaking his head. "That's not what I'm saying at all. If anything, I need you to be more involved. Not just with James, but with the broader image of this family." She blinked, caught off guard by his words. "I'm not sure I understand." Frederick moved to his desk, leaning against its edge. "You have a perspective that I don't. You see things I miss. And, frankly, you connect with James in ways I struggle to. I want to use that to build something better, for him and for this family." Olivia's mind raced. Was he asking her to take on a role beyond that of a nanny? To become, in some way, an advisor or confidant? The weight of the suggestion was both flattering and daunting. "Mr. Ashcroft," she began carefully, "I appreciate your trust, but I'm not sure how I fit into this broader image." "That's what we'll figure out," he said, his tone decisive. Together, the day passed in a blur of normalcy, but Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Frederick's words replayed in her mind, their implications becoming clearer with each passing hour. She wasn't just a nanny anymore, not in his eyes. She was being drawn into the fabric of the Ashcroft legacy, a world she had always observed from the outside. Later that afternoon, Frederick invited her to join him at James's school for a meeting with his teacher. It was another unexpected move, but Olivia agreed, sensing that this was part of the broader role he had hinted at. The school, with its ivy-covered walls and sprawling green lawns, was as intimidating as ever. Olivia followed Frederick into the brightly lit classroom, where James's teacher, Ms. Turner, greeted them with a warm smile. "Mr. Ashcroft, Ms. Bennett, thank you for coming," she said, gesturing for them to sit. "I wanted to discuss James's progress and a few observations we've made." Frederick nodded, his expression neutral. "Go on." Ms. Turner glanced at Olivia, as if seeking her approval to continue. "James is a bright and curious child. He excels in academics, but we've noticed he tends to isolate himself during group activities. He's very attached to Ms. Bennett, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it may be contributing to his reluctance to engage with his peers." Frederick's jaw tightened. "Are you saying he's overly dependent on her?" "Not exactly," Ms. Turner said gently, "but fostering his independence might help him build stronger relationships with his classmates." Olivia spoke up, her voice steady but empathetic. "James thrives in environments where he feels understood and supported. If he's hesitant in group settings, perhaps it's because he's still finding his confidence." Ms. Turner nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good point. Building his confidence could make a significant difference." Frederick remained silent, his expression unreadable. But as they left the meeting, Olivia noticed a change in his demeanor, a subtle shift from defensiveness to contemplation. That evening, as the three of them sat in the living room, James sprawled on the rug with his toys. Frederick seemed more relaxed than he had been in days. He leaned back in his armchair, a glass of scotch in hand, and watched his son with a faint smile. "Olivia," he said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Yes, Mr. Ashcroft," she replied, glancing up from the book she was reading. "Thank you," he said simply, "for today, for everything." Her surprise must have shown on her face because he added, "I don't say it enough, but you've been a steady presence in this house, in James's life, and in mine." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, leaving her momentarily speechless. She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "It's my job, Mr. Ashcroft, but thank you." As the evening wore on, Olivia couldn't help but feel that Frederick's gamble, his decision to involve her more deeply in his and James's lives, was beginning to pay off. The cracks in his carefully constructed facade were still there, but through them, she could see glimpses of a man who was trying, in his own way, to be better. And for the first time, she wondered if those cracks might be the very thing that allowed something new, something stronger, to emerge. The day began in a whirlwind of activity. The Ashcroft estate buzzed with quiet urgency as Frederick prepared for another school-related event, this time a private meeting with the Parents' Council. The exclusive gathering was meant to discuss upcoming changes to school policies, and Frederick had insisted on attending despite his growing frustration with what he called performative decision-making. Olivia noticed his restlessness as he adjusted his tie in the foyer mirror, his movements sharp and deliberate. James sat on the staircase, watching his father with wide eyes, while Olivia stood nearby, holding a tablet with Frederick's notes. "Are you sure you want to go alone, Mr. Ashcroft?" she asked hesitantly, breaking the silence. Frederick turned, his gaze softer than she expected. "No," he said, after a pause. "You're coming with me." The meeting was held in one of the school's grand conference rooms, its walls adorned with portraits of past benefactors. The room exuded an air of solemnity, its heavy oak table surrounded by an intimidating array of parents dressed in designer suits and subtle but unmistakable displays of wealth. Frederick walked in with his usual confidence, but Olivia could feel the weight of the room's collective gaze shifting toward her as she followed. Whispers rippled through the group, and a few polite smiles were offered, though they were clearly perfunctory. "Good to see you, Frederick," said a tall woman with perfectly coiffed hair. She extended a hand, her gaze flickering briefly to Olivia. "And who might this be?" Olivia Bennett, Frederick said smoothly. She's James's nanny. She has a unique perspective I think we'll all benefit from. The woman's smile tightened, but she said nothing further, instead turning her attention to the agenda. Olivia took a seat beside Frederick, acutely aware of how out of place she must seem in this environment. Still, she reminded herself why she was here. For James. The meeting began predictably, with parents discussing budgets, fundraising initiatives, and potential curriculum changes. The conversation was laced with a subtle but persistent undercurrent of competition. Olivia listened quietly, observing the dynamics of the room. The parents' concern for their children's education was genuine, but their discussions often veered towards self-interest, how their family names would be remembered, how their legacies would be shaped. It wasn't long before the topic of James came up, though not by name. A man at the far end of the table, whose voice carried a note of superiority, brought up the issue of certain students who struggle to integrate socially. "We've noticed it as well," said another parent, her tone carefully neutral. "It's not uncommon for children to rely too heavily on familiar adults. It's something we need to address, for their sake and for the school's reputation." Frederick's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Olivia spoke up. "May I say something?" she asked, her voice calm but steady. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. She could feel Frederick tense beside her, but he didn't stop her. "As someone who spends a lot of time with the children, I see things from a different perspective," Olivia began. "Children thrive when they feel secure and supported. Independence doesn't come from removing familiar connections. It comes from knowing those connections are there when they need them." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then, to Olivia's surprise, a woman at the other end of the table nodded. "She has a point," the woman said. "My daughter struggled with the same thing last year. It wasn't until we worked on building her confidence at home that she started to engage more at school." The shift in the room was subtle but palpable. Olivia glanced at Frederick, whose expression remained unreadable, though his silence spoke volumes. As the meeting continued, Olivia felt a newfound sense of purpose. Her voice, once unheard in these circles, was beginning to carry weight. She contributed sparingly but thoughtfully, and by the time the meeting ended, she sensed that she had left an impression, not just on the other parents, but on Frederick as well. Outside the conference room, Frederick turned to her, his expression softer than she had seen it in a long time. "You surprised me in there," he admitted. "In a good way." Olivia smiled faintly. "I wasn't sure if I overstepped." "You didn't," he said firmly. "You said what I couldn't, and they listened." His words warmed her, but they also left her with a lingering question. Why hadn't Frederick spoken up himself? The man who commanded boardrooms and gala crowds had held back in a meeting about his own son. The answer, Olivia suspected, lay somewhere within the walls he had built around himself, walls that were beginning to crack. That evening, back at the Ashcroft estate, James was unusually quiet during dinner. Olivia noticed the way his gaze flickered between her and Frederick, his small hands fidgeting with his fork. "Is everything okay, James?" she asked gently. He hesitated, then nodded. "I just don't want you to leave," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Olivia's heart ached at his words. "Why would you think I'm leaving?" she asked, her tone soft but insistent. "Because you went to the meeting," he said, looking down at his plate. "That's what happens, right? Nannies leave when they start doing other things." Frederick's expression shifted, a rare look of vulnerability crossing his face. "James," he said, his voice uncharacteristically tender, "Olivia isn't going anywhere. She's part of this family." The word family hung in the air, its weight settling over all three of them. Olivia glanced at Frederick, her surprise mirrored in his own expression. It was the first time he had acknowledged her role in their lives so openly, and it was a moment she wouldn't forget. That night, as Olivia tucked James into bed, he looked up at her with a small smile. "You're the best nanny ever," he said, his voice sleepy but sincere. She leaned down and kissed his forehead. "And you're the best kid ever," she replied. As she closed his door and made her way to her own room, Olivia felt a sense of clarity she hadn't had before. Her voice, once quiet, was now being heard. And though the path ahead was still uncertain, She knew she was exactly where she needed to be. The rain fell in steady sheets against the large bay windows of Frederick's study. The rhythmic tapping provided a melancholic backdrop to the evening's events. Frederick sat behind his desk, a glass of scotch in one hand and a stack of documents in front of him. Olivia stood nearby, unsure whether her presence was required or merely tolerated. James had gone to bed hours earlier, his small frame cocooned in blankets, unaware of the growing tension that hung over the house. "You've been quiet tonight," Frederick remarked, not lifting his gaze from the papers. "I thought you needed space," Olivia replied, her voice steady. "You seemed preoccupied." He let out a low chuckle, though it lacked humor. "Preoccupied doesn't begin to cover it." Olivia hesitated, then stepped closer. "If there's something I can help with," Frederick cut her off, his voice sharper than intended. "This isn't something you can fix, Olivia." The weight of his words settled between them. She wanted to ask what he meant, but the guarded look in his eyes told her he wasn't ready to elaborate. Instead, she turned toward the bookshelf, running her fingers over the spines of volumes that had likely never been read. "You once told me I see things you miss," she said quietly. "Maybe you should let me see this." Frederick looked at her then, his expression softening just enough to reveal the man behind the mask. "It's James," he admitted. "And his future." The revelation came in fragments, halting and uncertain, as if Frederick were testing the waters with each sentence. James had been offered a rare opportunity, early admission to one of the most prestigious academies in the country. It was the kind of offer most parents would dream of, but it came with strings attached. The expectation that James would fit the mold of a perfect student, a future leader molded by tradition and legacy. "They expect a version of him that doesn't exist yet," Frederick said, his frustration evident. "And I don't know if I'm doing the right thing by pushing him toward it." Olivia took a seat across from him, her posture calm but attentive. "James isn't just a student, Frederick. He's your son. What does he want?" Frederick's gaze dropped to the desk. "He's too young to know what he wants. That's why it's up to me to decide." Olivia frowned. "But isn't it also up to you to listen? To give him the space to figure it out?" Her words lingered in the air, challenging yet not accusatory. Frederick leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "It's not that simple, Olivia. You've seen what this world is like. Expectations, judgments. Every decision I make for him is scrutinized." "You're right," she agreed. "But shielding him from those expectations won't make them disappear. It might just teach him to fear them." The conversation shifted into deeper territory as Frederick began to open up about his own childhood. He spoke of his father, a man whose relentless drive for perfection had shaped Frederick's life in ways both obvious and subtle. The pressure to succeed, to uphold the Ashcroft name, had been both a motivator and a burden. "I don't want to make the same mistakes he did," Frederick admitted, his voice quieter now. "But sometimes I feel like I already have." Olivia listened, her heart aching for the boy Frederick had once been and the father he was trying to become. "The fact that you're asking these questions means you're already doing better than he did." Frederick looked at her, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "You always know what to say." "It's not about knowing what to say," Olivia replied. "It's about knowing what James needs. And right now, he needs you to trust him." Later that night, as Olivia made her way to her room, she passed James's door. It was slightly ajar, and she paused, peeking inside. He was awake, staring at the ceiling, his small hands clasped over his chest. "Can't sleep?" she asked, stepping into the room. James shook his head. "Are you and Dad fighting?" Olivia's heart sank. "No, we're not fighting. We're just talking about some important things." "About me?" he asked, his voice small. She nodded, sitting on the edge of his bed. "Yes, about you, but not in a bad way. Your dad loves you very much, James. He just wants to make the best choices for you." James was quiet for a moment, then said, "I don't want to go to a new school." Olivia's breath caught. "Why not?" "Because I like it here," he said simply. "I like my teachers. I like my friends. And I like being close to you and Dad." Her chest tightened at his honesty. "Have you told your dad how you feel?" James shook his head. "He wouldn't understand." Olivia placed a hand on his shoulder. "You'd be surprised. Sometimes, people just need to hear the truth to understand. The next morning, Frederick found James waiting for him in the study. The boy's presence was unexpected, but the determined look on his face gave Frederick pause. "What's on your mind, buddy?" he asked, setting down his coffee. James hesitated, glancing toward the door where Olivia stood, silently encouraging him. "I don't want to go to the new school, Dad," he said, his voice steady despite his small stature. "I like it here, and I don't want to leave Olivia." Frederick blinked, caught off guard by his son's candor. "James, it's a great opportunity. It could open so many doors for you. But what if I don't want those doors?" James countered, his innocence belying the wisdom in his words. Frederick looked at Olivia, his expression torn. She gave him a small nod, silently urging him to listen. After a long pause, Frederick knelt in front of James, placing his hands on the boy's shoulders. "If staying here is what makes you happy, then that's what we'll do. I want you to be happy, James. That's more important than anything else." James threw his arms around his father's neck, and for the first time in what felt like years, Frederick allowed himself to let go of the weight he had been carrying. That evening, the Ashcroft household felt lighter. Frederick was more present, James more at ease, and Olivia more certain than ever that her role in their lives went far beyond what she had ever imagined. But even as they shared a quiet dinner together, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a larger journey, a journey that would challenge them all in ways they had yet to understand. The Ashcroft estate was quieter than usual, as if the house itself were taking a moment to exhale. Olivia walked through the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, her thoughts as steady as her stride. It had been weeks since Frederick had decided against enrolling James in the prestigious academy, a choice that had rippled through their lives in ways none of them had anticipated. The tension that had once defined the household had given way to something softer, something that felt remarkably like peace. James was thriving. His days were filled with laughter and curiosity, his afternoons spent at the park or sprawled on the living room floor with his toys. Frederick, too, seemed changed. His schedule was still demanding, but he now carved out time for moments that mattered. Reading to James before bed, sitting with him over breakfast, or simply watching as he played. Olivia had become an integral part of these moments, her role evolving from caregiver to confidant, not just for James, but for Frederick as well. She felt a quiet pride in the way things had shifted, though she still hesitated to take too much credit. It wasn't her house, after all. It wasn't her family. Or was it? One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of purple and orange, Frederick invited Olivia to join him in the garden. He stood near the fountain, his hands in his pockets, his expression contemplative. The sound of trickling water filled the silence between them as Olivia approached. "You've been quiet today," he remarked without looking at her. "I've just been thinking," she replied, "about everything that's changed." Frederick turned to face her, his gaze steady. "It's a lot, isn't it?" She nodded. "Good changes, though." He smiled faintly, his usual guardedness giving way to something warmer. "I owe a lot of that to you." Olivia shook her head. "You made the choices, Frederick. I just pointed out what was already there." "That's modest of you," he said, his tone wry. "But it's not true. You've changed this house, Olivia. You've changed me." The weight of his words settled over her, leaving her momentarily speechless. She had always known her presence in the Ashcroft household was significant, but hearing it articulated so plainly was something else entirely. The following week brought another pivotal moment in the Ashcrofts' journey. Frederick had invited a small group of parents from James's school to the estate for an informal gathering. It was an opportunity to reset expectations, to build connections outside the formalities of the Parents' Council. Olivia had spent the day helping the staff prepare, ensuring everything was perfect. But as the guests began to arrive, she found herself unexpectedly nervous. These were the same people who had scrutinized her at the gala, who had questioned Frederick's decisions and whispered about her place in his life. Frederick, however, seemed unfazed. He greeted the guests with his usual poise, making small talk and guiding them toward the garden where the gathering was being held. James darted between the adults, his laughter filling the air, while Olivia stayed near the edges, observing. It wasn't long before one of the mothers approached her, The woman was elegant, her smile practiced but genuine enough. "You must be Olivia," she said. Olivia nodded. "I am. And you are?" "Elizabeth," the woman replied, extending a hand. "My son is in James's class. He talks about you quite a bit." Olivia smiled, though she was surprised. "All good things, I hope?" Elizabeth laughed softly. "Very good things. James seems quite fond of you." They chatted for a while, the conversation light but meaningful. By the time Elizabeth moved on, Olivia felt a small but significant shift in how she was perceived. Perhaps the whispers were no longer as critical as they had once been. Later that evening, after the last guest had left, Frederick found Olivia in the kitchen. She was tidying up, her movements unhurried but purposeful. He leaned against the doorway, watching her for a moment before speaking. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said. Olivia glanced up, surprised. "I didn't do much. You were yourself," he countered. "That's more than enough." She set down the dish she was holding, meeting his gaze. "Do you really mean that?" Frederick nodded. "I do. I don't say it enough. But this house wouldn't be the same without you." His words carried a weight that left Olivia unsure how to respond. She had always considered herself a part of James's life, but hearing Frederick acknowledge her place in his own was unexpected. As the days turned into weeks, Olivia found herself reflecting on what it meant to belong. The Ashcroft estate was still a world apart from the one she had grown up in, but it no longer felt alien. It felt, in a way, like home. James continued to flourish, his confidence growing with each passing day. He had begun making more friends at school, his natural curiosity drawing others to him. Frederick, too, seemed lighter, his priorities shifting in ways that brought him closer to his son. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, James curled up with a book. Frederick turned to Olivia. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone thoughtful, "about the future." Olivia tilted her head, waiting for him to continue. "I want to make this house more than what it's been," he said. "Not just a place to live, but a place to grow. For James. For all of us." His words took her by surprise. "All of us?" Frederick nodded. "You've become a part of this family, Olivia, and I think it's time I acknowledged that." Her chest tightened at his words, but she managed to smile. "Thank you, Frederick. That means more than you know." That night, as Olivia stood by her bedroom window, she looked out at the estate, its lights glowing softly against the night sky. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the unexpected twists and turns that had shaped her place in the Ashcroft family. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. For the first time in a long time, Olivia felt at peace, not just with where she was, but with where she was going. The future was still uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure. She was exactly where she was meant to be.